Oops. Hold on.
Is this the one?
Click the one you just have.
This one?
Yeah. See now, input level.
Oh, you're going now.
Yeah, test.
Okay.
Are good?
Yes, we should be good. Yep.
We previously talked about doing the mitigation plan. And so I sent you all copies of the emergency response plans from Infomark and the city to show you what is in existence present. And thinking about it, like I said, in a follow-up email, this really is an emergent. It isn't an emergency response. The mitigation, this is a long-term event that causes emergencies. So do we really need a mitigation plan? Is there a purpose for it that we weren't putting work into preparing a plan? So that was the main item of discussion, the first item of discussion. Do we think we need something? Would be an emergency plan, it would be some type of long-term plan, I would suspect, but I'm not sure it's needed because the emergency plans address the emergencies that are generated by What's the board's opinion before we dive into that?
Just a comment,
Sure.
given everything that at least I've seen regarding sea level rise. And I've noticed looking back over the minutes, there are also items that I'm supposed to come back with information about wind and precipitation. And I'm struggling a little bit to find good stuff there.
You weren't here for the meeting when we had GMBs here
Okay.
about wind. And unfortunately, Sharon had been away with English things prepared in time for this meeting, but you will get to. And it was decided, we discussed it, and they felt that 120-mile-an-hour wind is fine for this area. And that's already in the building codes. I understand it, Robin. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, we'd have to verify the 21, because again, the city's going to the 21 building code
By the end of the year.
by the end of the year.
So what was agreed by the committee at that point is that we would use what's in the building code for 120 miles per hour, whichever was greater.
Okay, so all I would suggest relative to what you just said is that, I mean, reading through all the materials that you sent, I think everything's probably in place. But I think the important point is that the point at which a plan like an emergency response plan will have to be activated, the frequency of those will increase through time, right? The high water levels, the times when we need to engage some level of fire drill, we talked about this a fair amount, will increase through time. So whether or not you have a particular plan for a certain elevation, I don't know, that's something to discuss, but we just need to acknowledge that through time, we will have more of these fire drills. We'll have more situations where we're going to have to be careful as to how we're doing things.
That I would assume would be put into those emergency plans as a statement up front that they should be reviewed like every 5 years. I don't think the plans and reading them have a specific time or flood elevation or any benchmark that they're set to. So for the most part, I think we can use it as is. But it would be good to have it noted that maybe every 5 years that it evaluated.
So one of the other points, somewhere in one of the plans, and I don't think it's this plan, the one that's in front of us. One of the other documents listed a number of sources for information, like weather service stuff. And those of you who know me from the city conversations, know that for quite a while I've been saying the best available information we have about water levels comes from the long-term record that's been maintained at Cape May Lewes Ferry. And if you look up in National Weather Service and you punch in something about Lewes sea level, water levels, tide levels, you'll get an actual real-time monitor with historical information attached to it that says it's Lewes, but in fact it's the Cape May Lewes Ferry dock, which is all fine and dandy for many times that we might want to understand how the water is fluctuating. I'm curious, Austin or Robin, since you have of water levels that were reached over the last couple of days around the plant. Because my experience has been watching this for a number of years. The water levels inside of Roosevelt in the canal, Great Marsh. When you have days worth of northeast winds above, say, 25 knots, which we had, and we had it in May as well. Things start to change, and what happens inside doesn't necessarily correlate with what's going on the outside. And when I read through all of this, more than ever before, I felt like maybe BPW is the place where we need to be pushing some sort of a real-time monitoring system inside of Roosevelt Inlet, something that goes on around the plant or something that goes on somewhere in the canal to help us understand how water levels may be rising and aren't captured by the Cape May Lewes Ferry.
I haven't heard much about it recently. It seems to me that 6-7 years ago, Leathers State was taking measurements out there at the dock. I mean, at Canal Front Park,
Okay,
ran.
okay,
I don't know if he's still doing that or not.
all right.
That I remember meeting him out there one day and looking at that.
I mean, and this is going back, over the last couple of years. We talked with DelDOT about putting in monitors on the canal and Canary Creek. And there were others, and it just seems like nothing ever happens on that. And I agree with you. The Back Bay flooding is somewhat uncoupled from the ocean. And I think so we can start to build a historical trend on the canal side and Canary Creek side is important. And it's not rocket science. If DelDOT doesn't want to play, that should be something, I mean, I know I've seen numbers on what it would cost to put them in. It's not significant. And it's something that
Yeah.
the city and BPW would benefit from.
Well, what kind of number is it? Is it something BPW should do?
So,
Is it like $250,000?
no, no. The city of Bethany Beach realized the same problem a number of years ago, and they now have a system of a couple, if not a half dozen real-time monitors set up, water level monitors set up around the city. When you look at elevations in Bethany Beach, there's a reason why they're doing that. They have a lot of low ground that can be flooded. Someone in the mayor's office, someone in the city office would have that information. My sense is, from a conversation I had years ago, is it might be at most $100,000. It might be $50,000. I don't know what it is. I don't think it's that much.
I think I saw numbers in the $20,000 to $50,000 per. Now, the disadvantage and reason why DelDOT wasn't thrilled or wanted to do it was it wouldn't be integrated to the state system and reported up. But if the state isn't going to do something, these storms are clear evidence that we need something to protect both the citizens and the ratepayer assets, and should be done.
Okay, so let's say you needed $50,000 just to put in monitoring stations, and to BPW isn't somewhere in the canal the most important spot.
Sure. And in the well, you can do it in any of the marinas, but the county has, I mean, the city has their own marina there. That'd be a good place to do it. And I think it should be done in conjunction with the city, because they can do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's road flooding,
Yeah.
it's emergency access. So, I mean, splitting a number like that between the city and BPW should not.
One of the things we have going forward, I guess that's something out of that going forward, would be is a meeting with the city soon after we get all our ducks in a row. See, we can discuss that during that meeting.
I mean, the way I look at this, having looked at the data collected at the Cape May Lewes Ferry for a number of years while I lived down on Lewes Beach, and looking at the water levels on places like Cedar Street, so on. I think if we had such a monitor monitoring system in place, at least one station, say, at the Lewes Marina, the city of Lewes Marina. We could perhaps start to develop a better understanding of when, how, where the levels deviate inside of the canal
Mhm.
versus what happens out on the outside with historical data.
That's-
Ultimately, we would be able to develop some sort of predictive model when we know we've got winds of so much, some magnitude and from some direction, we can start to plan for that fire drill a little more specifically.
I think I've
Get ahead of
mentioned this before. One thing that really bothers me is that 62 storm, which is on that. That's on Savannah Road. Is up to here. If you stand in front, it's up to my chest. But they say the storm after Sandy, following January, was the greatest storm. Well, it wasn't. That's measured in buoy out someplace
That's the problem.
out in the bay. Yeah, so that's, you make a good point.
That's exactly why those numbers don't make sense.
So question in regard to this collaboration between the city and BPW. City, to my knowledge, doesn't have people who were equipped to do the analysis of this. So is that something the BPW would take on? Let's say there was a collaboration between the city to install the equipment, fair enough. But then
I think we could.
you need to do something with the equipment. You're not there to just let it sit there and, but
Robin, did you raise your hand?
But I'm just looking at it from the point of view of, well enough, it makes sense to gather some of this data, but then who's gonna take charge of doing the analysis and implications?
I would suggest that the first attempt to be a collective BPW city,
To have a conversation about it.
no,
Oh.
to go to DelDOT,
Oh,
to
fair
get
enough.
them to do it,
Okay.
because having it as part of the integrated system,
Oh, you're
so that as
Where
every,
they're already doing analysis.
right,
Right.
and it would be accessible to
To everyone.
Joe Thomas, Sussex County,
Sure,
and
sure.
everyone else.
All right,
Failing that,
sure.
and
Okay.
we don't give it a long time, because we don't want to go around with another one of these DelDOT, pipe dream things.
Yeah.
Then,
But you're asking
Doing-
them to add it to their data collection that they're already doing.
Right.
Statewide.
Yeah.
Ken, the other way, we have another really special opportunity here, which is with the university just down the road.
Understand.
Sure.
And, between them and the climate office, I would say that we
Okay.
should be able to find partners that can help with the
Okay.
analysis.
I just don't want it to be, where I take this back and they go, well, and then what?
Right.
The question, and then what kind of arises. So, okay, I'm good.
My judge. I did this in Sandy. Boardwalk. Now front park is elevation 5. So if it's up to the boardwalk, it's elevation 5. The floor of the restroom is elevation 6. And like in Sandy, I know it didn't get to 6 there because the water was lapping almost to the step up onto the restroom. So that was just shy of 6 and I don't think it got into the inns door.
no, it is not, it was,
So, but it was right there.
Yeah.
So that's my gauge. That and walking out in my garage, it's up above my knee.
That's up close and personal analysis. Yes.
high gauge.
Yeah.
There you go, there you go. We'll have it.
Marks on my leg. So,
And he has waders, and he's got little marks on the waders to.
This is an app that I look at that shows the location that you're talking about. And I'm wondering who runs this app and where this information comes through.
I'm not sure what that app is, but
It's
but
just called
close to
Tides Near Me. or-
most of those points, like the one that's popped up there, that's the NOAA long-term station that's at the Cape May Lewis Ferry. Literally, because I've
Yeah.
become kind of
It
a
gives,
weather
it
geek.
it gives the week-long expectations of high tides and low tides at that location and other locations along Cape Henlopen and all the ways further south.
Right, but
I'm
again,
just
so
wondering who runs that, and if
That's
our
NOAA.
information could get pumped in somehow.
that's NOAA, that's the National Weather Service.
So
Along, I don't know if any of you have seen the Joe Thomas, he's the emergency director for Sussex County. And actually, what he does is he sends out reports during these type of, when there's an event. But it's extracted from the National Weather Service. And it has, I mean, the tide stuff in there is perfect. Because he shows not only the historic or natural historic, but the projected future. And so you can actually see the crest for the next
That's right.
incoming high tides and winds. But that's all coming from the National Weather Service, and it's a perfect, beautiful sinusoidal,
Yeah,
you know,
Yeah.
That's basically the tide chart with some modifications
with
based on,
modifications based upon
Yeah.
the storm surge.
right?
And, you know, if, that's why getting it into the bigger system would be better, because not only would you get the Roosevelt Inlet, you would get the,
I think one of the things that I found, because I've been looking at this for a while, and I'm not a climatologist. But I've been looking at apps like that.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming the data set that Mark Thomas, what's
Joe
her name,
Thomas.
Joe Thomas is using.
oh, so
And-
you
and
still
it's-
have that? Did you pull it up?
I'll have to send it to Sharon real quick.
So as soon as I saw the forecast for this last week, I started expecting to see the coastal flooding advisories. It took a long time for them to show up.
Yeah.
And just based on my, qualitative sense of how things have gone here, I expected that we would have flood advisories, and the mistake I made was I didn't actually say something to anybody. It took a couple of days. What I'm looking for is a way to be able to predict based on the predicted winds, which come long before the predicted floods, that we're starting to be ready to activate so that it doesn't catch us off guard, because they normally, this coastal flood advisories, they come in like 12 hours before they actually happen. Maybe that's enough time. I don't know. But it would be nice to have more time, I would think.
How high does the wire have to be around it before the plant becomes compromised? Or, I mean, you got a couple of levels of compromise. One, nobody can get to it, which, roads were flooded the other day. Then nobody can get it in and out, then
Actual equipment.
actual equipment gets threatened or whatever. Or flooded.
Yeah, what got me thinking about all this was looking through this plan. And, when you activate equipment to come and do various things, I started thinking, well, if American Legion Road is underwater, how many of those pieces of equipment can't do what we're expecting them to be able to do?
I started thinking too, shouldn't BPW have a boat?
Yeah, it's 25-foot Grady White is right next to the pump station.
With the teeth off and.
I thought I saw you with a kayak. Maybe it wasn't.
I mean, as a practical matter, knowing how high it is one thing, getting to the plant is another.
Yeah, I
Well,
think, was it Sandy or, no, it wasn't Sandy, it was too far back. Maybe it was,
It was a nor'easter.
Nor'easter.
Yeah.
At one point, we had the guard come in just before I got on board. Guard came in with their
But
big trucks.
we've used big pieces of equipment, not trucks, to get back there.
Our own equipment.
Mhm. I mean, the one thing is if you do get caught in a situation like that, sometimes you do have, because the elevation kind of gets higher as you get towards the old bike path, which is now, well, the old railroad tracks, which is now the bike path. You can theoretically come in the backside off of Freeman Highway to get in if you needed to, but it's a real conversation, which is why bringing DelDOT to the table, because if you were to drive around town and you were to look at where your issues are, your issues lie at the end of Polytown Road, Savannah Road, and New Road. Those are your big three. I mean, we went out, GMB went out, looked at a couple of the ditches around town. But when you look at, Canary Creek backs up and obviously that pushes back. But those are your three biggest areas, and they're also
They're all DelDOT.
correct.
And
Correct.
Cedar Street.
Correct. Yes. See it.
But to Bob's point, we're having a study done by GHD on hardening the plant. And it includes access. So, we expect that to be, out within the next month or so. Because that's one of the key considerations of, even if you could harden the plant, if you can't get to it, what's the difference?
Well,
So
okay.
that's all in that engineering study.
And how about the pump stations and the other infrastructure that's spread all over town? At what level?
Well, that's the one we worked on initially is flooding elevation, so.
We discussed about elevating the equipment.
So I think regardless of how things go forward, what you just said needs to be worked out so that you have that higher ground access to the plant from Freeman Highway. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
That's like a no-brainer.
Yeah, don't tell anybody. It's a secret access. But that
So
is,
that should be something in emergency plan.
because you're basically gonna have to drive on, you're gonna have to drive on the existing bike path and or railroad tracks to gain access on the backside.
Yeah.
But you also won't be able to get big equipment back in there.
Yeah.
That's where, like, with the city having the bigger loader, we have the Cat and the New Holland loaders that we can get back there with, but as far as anything beyond that, you'd almost need, Deuce and a half. The city had the Hummer, the police department had the Hummer, but that was sold.
Well, but then there's, chemical and
And fuel,
fuel.
correct. You got 4,000
Sharon,
gallons.
can you scroll down on this?
Yeah.
There's the chart I wanted to show you.
On it's toward the end. Right there.
There. But you see it, and it's projecting tide cycles into the future.
So there's a website that you can get directly to those charts without going through this briefing. And it's
Yes.
it's called the NOAA Coastal Inundation Dashboard.
Yeah.
And it's the only place that actually takes the tide chart and develops the predictive additions to it based on the wind and so on. And that's a very powerful graphic and source of information for planning, near-term planning.
And so to your point, Ken, is this resolves the issue with analyzing data.
Sure.
Because it's the National Weather Service
Right.
that's doing it. And we get it from both the southern Virginia side and the New Jersey, Mount Holly. So actually, depending upon which tide gauge you're looking at, depends upon whose jurisdiction it falls in.
So we'll initially talk to the city about the initial idea and approach, hopefully both of us can approach DelDOT. Or,
Collaboratively.
yeah. See what they do. That's a very good point.
And then the university is.
And you
our partners, right?
But getting back to the whether we should have our own plan, is there any? We can see where maybe the city's plan, Infomark's plan can be updated to address a few things. But other than that, is there any need to prepare a plan of our own? Okay.
I'm curious about the studies that are going on now about the alternatives to locations, for instance, of the treatment plant. And are we ahead of ourselves, putting a lot of effort into a plan for a plant that need be moved or modified and for other reasons?
Well, this study is almost done. And I think the next couple of months it will be done. And then there'll be public meetings on the alternatives. So I think that might be resolved over the next 4 to 6 months, what's going to happen. So I don't think it should be too far out with some of these things.
Well, the only other thing I'd say is that regardless of which option we go with, it's a 3 to 5 year build out. So, we can't, I don't feel it's safe to,
Just leave it,
if it was immediate, like January, we're gonna be gone, that would be one thing, but
You know how long it takes to get a treatment plan going.
and how long is
It never stops.
They've never done.
My thought was that, the mitigation plans that or the emergency plans that you sent us could use some updating. Well, I have a few thoughts. First of all, I didn't see anything about the water treatment plant and emergencies that may affect that, and that seemed like an oversight. And then when I think of a mitigation plan for BPW, I think of like long-term, how are we going to plan to address sea level rise? Not an emergency plan. I think those are kind of two separate things.
But isn't that what we're building? By coming up with this criteria, and then at some point we have to turn it over to staff, consultants. I was going to do that towards the end of this meeting, where we're going from here, because there's only so much we can do. We can't design the things that we're given criteria for.
Yeah, so
What would-
I'm sorry, to your point. Just like Press it. We will have to put a plan in place for when we're going to harden or underground utilities out on the beach. I make that up, or, replace the water tower or whatever. But I don't think that's something the press what we can do here, because there's a lot of engineering and costs that need to be considered. And that's something that, the BPW is going to need to do, because we can't just say, these are at risk and we'll get to them someday.
So is there value? I was trying to figure out something like what you just said, These emergency response plans seem great, with the exception of all these things that are highlighted.
Yeah.
But I think there is some sort of roadmap, if you will, some sort of statement or acknowledgement of changing conditions through moving into the future. It would be nice to somehow document and put out there for people to consider. Maybe it doesn't have to be BPW. Ideally, it would also include the city, that sort of acknowledges, here are the conditions that we imagine are going to be changing over timeframe A, timeframe B, timeframe C. And the following phenomena within our service area are affected by those changes.
Isn't that what the city's regional committee was going to do? I wasn't on it.
You mean the committee we were working on?
Yeah.
Well, there were two committees, and I was not participant in the first one, the second one. The executive. The challenges we faced with that committee. I think where there were a number of participants who were reticent to make changes that affected property owners'
Yeah.
fiscal situations. I think that if I were to put a point of emphasis where that was very obvious to me, that
Short-term.
it was a short-term view. It was not a long-term view. It was not a strategic view. It was a tactical view taken by many of the participants. And as a consequence, the two recommendations that emerged from that had approval from the committee have no teeth.
Look at.
Did I say that out loud?
Yeah. So.
I'll be saying it at a public conference this week. So I'm just practicing on for the conference this week.
Thank you for that statement.
But, and that's what my presentation, my couple of charts that are part of this presentation basically say. It's polite, but it's to the point. So,
But look at what's.
I'm sorry, it was just to Press's point was, yes, that was the original charge
Yes.
of the sea level rise committee, not the executive.
not the executive committee. right?
And, we had gone down, we were probably 90% of the way there when it was disbanded. But it was ordinance changes, implementation, it was the whole alleyway, so.
And the executive committee was, it was recommended to that committee that there were options to do some similar things with ordinance changes and other things. But those were sidelined by,
So-
for the beach community.
But so consider all the imagery that we've seen over the last several days from Southwest Florida. Okay,
for
yeah, okay. So of all the imagery I've seen, the image that keeps sticking in my mind is of the image of the road on Sanibel, not the causeway, the road. And all the pavement broken up and all the sand underneath it exposed. Okay, that is a problem we are gonna face here.
Mhm.
And we can either wait for it to happen. Or we can start to lay the groundwork and take more deliberate
But
steps to
again,
deal with that.
That's not our charge. I mean,
Well,
I understand.
so,
That's very important, but once we get our ducks in a row,
okay,
we gotta meet with the city and see how that's a city thing, how we can work with it.
sorry, the image that I'm suggesting here suggests an interaction between groundwater and surface water.
Mhm.
That, yes, from a streets perspective is a city problem, but it has major implications for everything we do. I say we here
Under the roads.
with water and wastewater and stormwater. Right?
But I think you're right. I mean, you're 100% right. What we've talked about before is by the time it starts getting to that thing, storms are gonna be so frequent and so intensive that how many people are gonna still, or are we gonna make all these changes to pumping stations and, meters and everything else? But no one's gonna be there, or the likelihood of people. Gonna be there.
Judging from the phenomena that Candace just described. I don't think we can count on that happening. On its own. And that's why I'm saying,
You're suggesting that there won't be any attrition of people deciding to rebuild.
the attrition won't happen until an event like what we
Right,
just saw happen in
right,
Southwest
Where
Florida
things just
happens.
wash away and,
Right,
and you have like cement slabs and nothing on them.
right, and maybe I'm crazy about this. It just seems to me that with all the information that's available today. We should be able to take a more reasonable, rational, deliberate. Path between today and whenever that event is.
But is that, I think that's the city's issue as well. We're doing the utility thing. I mean, I know it's gonna impact
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
water lines and sewer.
We
lines.
gotta protect BPW's facilities and figure out how to respond to it.
and as our compatriot in the county always says, we don't make planning decisions. The county engineer doesn't make planning decisions. We're charged with providing services where the city says services need to be. We can't unilaterally say, we're gonna cut the pipes on Lewes Beach and shut everything off because we don't think it's worth investing money for the future. That's not our value. So if the city says that's a buildable lot, we have to provide service to that lot.
So,
I mean,
so
I don't like it, but I mean,
Let me just try.
like
something.
isn't the right.
That's not a decision that you
Right.
arbitrarily can make. What based upon
Unilaterally.
DPW.
What we, BPW needs to think about, a little bit at least, that I didn't see in here is, let's say there's a severe cut in power. And we can only serve, assuming that it's not a complete zero. You want to get the hospital up. Then what? And is there some plan around that? Let's say you get a 50% cut for some reason. How do you deal with that? And another thing that I didn't see in here, but maybe exists elsewhere in the county or elsewhere, is who's in charge? I once had, well, he's at the national conference in Ohio this week and can't get back.
he's on the boat, he's on the Great White.
And what happens when he gets tired? I once met a guy who had been one of the incident commanders at the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, he happened to live in Chicago, but in hours, they dragged him down there and they had a shift, you know. You show up an hour early, you're incident commander for X period of time. You go sleep, you come back. Is there a game plan for that? Because I see, call this guy, call that guy, but
I thought the city's plan kind of identifies the people that are
it does.
this and that, when we do have backup with Robin. Bar size organization, that's.
And does shelter in place mean they go here and shelter, or they stay home and shelter?
I'm an elevation 9, so I'm not a fan. I'd be-
We have
I mean,
lots.
and,
Yeah, they're in my office.
you know, we have cots and sea rats and stuff like that stocked up, so.
Sure.
And
I think the
sea
big-
rats still is.
Yeah, it's still.
Come
I
term.
think they're called
it's in his
MREs.
eye.
Oh,
It's in my
MRE.
closet. I still like to have it.
I'm sorry.
You're
showing your.
I think the
I
biggest thing
think there
is,
was work.
yeah, I think the biggest thing is to understand whether or not what's within the city's ERP is enough for us. I think that's what it comes down to. At the end of the day, I mean, the situation that you have brought up, like on the hospital dual fed,
Right.
both on water and on power. So if you lose one side, you can feed it from the other side. The issue you run into is that if you lose it on Delmarva's side, we have no control, absolutely zero. If we lose it from the midway to our tie-in on Savannah, the town's dark and we virtually have zero authority, impact, pull.
But it is one of the things, I mean, it's another study thing we're doing is we're looking at DRE, distributed energy, you know, whether it be batteries to power up key circuits and do other economic things for us like peak shaving costs. You know, the potential for a second power line, the potential for, you know, if everything else fails, you know, do we go and install a backup generator? Not high on my priority list or desires, but you know, it's part of the options.
But at this point, your sort of assumption is you got 100% or 0. from the power.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
We've looked into what the second line, but we're being told.
So there's no allocation.
So,
That's not yet.
well, there's some potentials down the line with some of these new bills, maybe, so.
And then on the water side, we had the tie-in with Tidewater, and then when the work was going on at Tower Hill, we made the decision to put a casing in the road so that we can theoretically do an additional tie-in with Tidewater. So we'd actually be looped on both sides of the system on Tidewater. We'd have a 12-inch on Kings, and we'd have a 12-inch on New Road.
So back to what Barbara was wondering about. Are there examples when you think about all these utility things that we're talking about? Are there things that you would do to harden? And I guess I'm thinking about the analog of what you were talking about with the Volkswagen walls, everybody was walking in. Are there things in the utility world that you would wish that you had at some point in the future when conditions get worse, that you don't have now, that if you had a more deliberate schedule, you could phase in? You know, every time a wire goes down, you would replace the wire with a different configuration. You would change the equipment that connects the wire. I don't really know. This is not my expertise. But if you have enough time and you can spread out the costs, are there things that you could do to migrate the system to better harden it so that it's less likely to fail in those events like a hurricane? Maybe it's all in place already.
No, it's not.
It's not, and the tough part is that you're still dealing, like, I'm gonna use the example of Sanibel or Lee County. When that hurricane was coming, there was a decision that was made to shut off both wastewater and water services to that side of town. How can you harden that? What can you do to actually harden where they would stay on? And is that realistic? Because on the wastewater side, you know, I went down, I was actually just in Savannah for an APPA conference, and we had talked, and that's on the power side. And we had talked about, risk management and how different communities are putting forward resiliency funds. And some, up here, since the storms aren't as frequent and they're not as intense as they are down there, there's kickback. I mean, even I can remember when I first started in 2016, the reserve fund was very healthy with us. And there was people that questioned whether or not that was too healthy.
Mhm.
The problem is that, and I asked the question when we were down there, is that I use the example I just used, is that people started questioning whether you have too much money in the bank and you become more of a for-profit. And the response that I received was, until a community is faced with the challenges of not having power
Mhm.
for an allotted amount of time, they do not realize the benefit of having that there. And so there's new ways of hedging that risk, not only on just having an account that sits there and appreciates, that's used for those instances, but there's insurance policies now that are coming out. It's called parametric insurance. It's new, but you're essentially hedging your risk by creating situational analysis to say, okay, hurricane comes, these are the winds, this is the forecasted, and based off your asset list, you're going to fund 80% of, you're going to look at an 80% loss, and you come up with basically an amount that would be funded in a very short amount of time. Never heard of it in my life. Never heard of it. To me, it sounds very expensive. I've reached out to our insurance company to see, give us some information so that we can, and they came back and said, it's new. I'm sure it's going to become more prevalent, especially down in the South, now that you're dealing with the situation, you're dealing with billions of dollars worth of damage. But it's interesting to see how not just you look at the utility field, but now you're looking at insurance field, and then you're looking at the reserve policies, and it's an evolving lens.
Well, and of course, there's having the money to do the
Correct.
corrective work, and then there's having the money but not being able to get it because there's already a 2-year backlog on the equipment. And I
Yeah.
know you've been working on that.
Mhm.
And I guess all I'm thinking is, to the extent that there are ways, again, of hardening so that the damage will be less. I mean, I don't know what that looks like.
That's
Well,
what
on-
we're working on. I think that's at the core of what we're working on. We're setting the parameters. Now let's turn over to the staff and consultants to implement it.
Yeah,
And
so
they don't want to broaden, I appreciate that you're going, where you're going, but some of it's out of the scope of this. If we get bogged down trying to solve the city's problems, we'll never get anything.
Sorry, my point in bringing all this up is, to Barbara's point, I don't think that it comes just from saying, yep, the emergency response plans are good and they'll serve us well. I think there's also some level of work to
absolutely.
figure out how we minimize the need to activate an emergency response plan. And maybe it's covered by the contractors you've got lined up down the line. I just don't want to lose sight of the fact. Somehow, not only the BPW, the city, I think, has to have a firm
It's an action.
plan. Well, but it's a roadmap. It's more deliberate than what do we do in emergency situations? It's how can we go from the present state today to some future state where there are different conditions, and we can move there rationally and in a budget wise.
So
And
I'd like,
Austin talks about water and wastewater. On the electrical side, Ian unfortunately is going to give us some really good evidence, because there were communities down in Florida which proactively had underground electric utilities. Hardin did these type of things. And we have real life data now on how the different communities. My brother lives in St. Pete. The lights never went off. They did a major job of undergrounding and going back and waterproofing everything.
There you
They
go.
lost
That's what I
power
want.
for 2 hours, and that was it. And that was in a localized. There are other communities down there that the undergrounding of utilities or other means, better tree trimming. all those type of things.
Right.
And what they did was they proactively shut off power to areas that are expected to be inundated because fresh water is very different than salt water. And, you know, with the fresh water, you can bring the equipment back up as soon as you dry it. Salt water, you then have trouble down the line. So there's gonna be a lot of good data coming out of this last event. You know,
Yeah, there's also that town that runs on solar power.
Yeah, I saw that, yeah,
Yeah.
new community was built 10 years ago or something.
Just talked about distributed, seems to me, the more we promote
Yes.
rooftop solar, the more we reduce the demand.
That brings up a thought that you're hardening your pump stations, for instance, and you got a generator at every one of them. You size that generator a little bit larger. It's nice and hardened, whatever that may take at whatever pump station.
We're doing two
That-
things,
Pardon me.
generator and bypass. Is,
Pumps.
that's the second piece that we're starting, it adds. a
I'm
better
just thinking
leg.
that the generators might be able to be used for the electric grid also.
You're saying you have 20 small generators that are feeding to the
Yeah,
grid.
and you maybe you build them a little bit larger than necessary just for the pump station, but a generator running the pump station just when the pump comes on and the pump turns off. More often when it floods.
it's an interesting idea. I don't know from the control scheme side,
Yeah.
because you now have,
It's beyond my,
yeah,
out of my bailiwicks.
you have to power the pump and then you have to backfeed up the
Right.
grid. And you need your transformers that are bi-directional, so. But it's an interesting idea because it
And maybe it's not just generate, maybe whatever we look at, you think about it being possibly useful in more than one direction. I can't think.
As we move towards EVs, then we could start thinking
Yeah,
that way too.
yeah.
We're not there yet.
You're saying broadening the set of applications where you would use
Yeah.
these.
These are your
These new
standard
pieces.
devices that you usually need to have. But why not look at them in a way that maybe they can help serve other portions of what's needed for a community to come back.
Okay, and Barbara, I want to answer your question about water treatment plant. There is some type of process for that plant, but I think it's written when the plant was.
Yeah, we have the SOPs for the plant, but then I just had to complete because as part of the new SRF applications, you have to submit an ERP for the plant itself, which then you look at terrorist attacks, you look at individual attacks on the individual wells, the treatment plant, the water tower. So I went through and did it. It's a pretty extensive list. It's through the state. It's actually SIMS is the program through Cartograph. So I have that. I just got to log into our virtual server to download it down.
Are you still using the pouring gas there for
Yes.
disinfection? Is there any thought of moving to hypochlorite?
Well, we're discussing what the future plans of the plant are, whether or not we're gonna keep the plant as, because right now it's a 2.8 million gallon plant, 2.88 million gallon plant. But it has the ability to peak out from an hourly perspective much higher. But whether or not we upgrade that plant or what the future of the existing plant or if we expand it.
I just, in terms of emergencies, hypochlorite is a lot easier to
Yeah.
deal with than gas.
All right, so. As far as, it sounds like we've recommending some things to upgrade. Existing plans, but not to produce a specific plan for the mitigation. So,
But to charge the state for
yes.
doing that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What's the term that Mike's using now, instead of approvals?
It's
No strenuous.
no strenuous.
No strenuous objections.
I've got it imprinted in my.
We can't vote during executive sessions and so forth. But we asked if there are no strenuous objections to what we're considering. I think I would avoid that.
No reason to silence.
So I'm curious, because I'm still hung up on this roadmap that I'm calling, that Barbara sort of suggested is different than the plans. Maybe it's all gonna happen. I'm not really sure. Are there criteria, Austin, Robin, that you need in order to say, we actually need a plan, we actually need to have a more dedicated document that just provides the roadmap? Is there a reason? Maybe we don't need it. I don't work in operations here. I'm always scheming along the lines of what Mark just suggested. How can we modify the way we're doing things to cover bases in ways that we didn't originally imagine using, equipment, resources, whatever. It's beyond my capability to evaluate. But I guess I do believe there's value in some kind of roadmap. If nothing else, just to help both sides of this equation figure out, because my experience with the mitigation effort at the city as well has been very focused on sort of pieces, emergency response sort of items. Are we okay today? Yeah, we're okay today. Doesn't seem to be a lot of talk about how things might be different in the future and what we might need to do differently 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, and what steps we need to take starting now to make sure that we're doing a better job in 20 years.
To that
And
point,
that's what I thought was the charter of this group.
and to,
But
well, I was gonna say, to that point, a resiliency fund was discussed during the executive thing. And I can tell you that, that is at some point will be discussed at the council level, but I can also tell you that the city budget is suffering from monies that it has not obtained recently through, I call it the 50%. There's 50% of the city budget that's reliably streams of income, and then there's another 50% that's predicated on the things that are beyond the city's control. The parking meters, the fines, the transfer taxes, et cetera. And so there are a number of those streams that, as well as the state of the stock market, that have put the capital budget, among other things, at risk within the city because those streams are not performing to the level of the budget that was planned. And so we're going to have to review our budget and kind of acknowledge that, those things are not, it's not like we're in a city where the people, all live there, 45% of the homes here are not occupied full time. And as a consequence, you've got downtimes, the cyclical nature of our budget. So the resiliency fund is not something that we have acted upon or are in a position to act on very soon. And then it would require other changes and the concurrence of the citizenry to make those changes. So,
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about the fund. I'm just thinking
Well-
about what steps we would take. that
Well, but
might factor
but-
into what the fund spends money on.
but steps are for the funding are needed to do anything, because the basics that are needed to be funded now are, which is why I bring up the budget, are affected by where the budget stands. And some of those things are going to have to fall by the wayside or be temporarily postponed because the budget is suffering from income streams that are not where we thought they would be.
And that's realized on our side too. I mean,
Yeah.
and to go along with kind of where you were going,
Mhm.
is that, I use the example of the water plant, right? The water plant is 2.88 MGD, right? So at what point do you modify the existing or diversify? So all 5 wells are in the exact same location. We, as part of the allocation permit, have to do a saltwater intrusion plan. At some point, there's a discussion of the what ifs. And those are the difficult decisions that you talk about now, so that you plan for the future and where you allocate, where do you want to put another well? Do you want another well? Do you want another well and treatment plant?
Is there a place where you could put a well?
And those,
that's a good
those,
point, yeah.
that's the piece you start talking,
Yeah.
just like down at the plant, the wastewater plant was built for a capacity of 2.25. But you're only utilizing what you have, not only from a permit level, which is more on the biological side, but then you have what you have in the capacity of filters. And so there's blanks in there, so you can put 4 more filters in there, which then increases your capacity there to go higher. So really what it comes down to is where we want to kind of decipher that charge of this committee is what falls more on staff or the board versus what falls more on mitigation. Because that's a true, I mean, we are as staff starting to work and compile saltwater intrusion plan, which that in itself will have, they're gonna have thresholds in it, once something happens here, and that's new. I mean, Bethany Beach has done it, and we've actually reached out to Bethany Beach because they're kind of the poster child that they're going through this process. Because once you go back for the allocation permit, these are the new steps that you need to have.
It's all about elevation.
Mhm.
They're gonna lead the way in a lot of these things.
But, to Ken's your point about, the budget, I mean, we're going through exactly the same thing, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And do we have a stock market?
Yeah, well,
But we also need to be very careful on the short term versus the long term, because a lot of these things that we're mitigating don't care what our budgets are. And so if it's gonna cost us more in the long term, and that's all a risk-based decision. And everyone has their own risk thresholds. And, that's one of the things that we're wrestling with at the BPW. I hope the city is doing the same thing.
well, and of course, I recognize that the BPW model. You have to operate the BPW as a business. The incomes, most of the income streams that come into the city, at least approximately 50%, are not coming from actual charges to the citizens.
Right.
For services rendered. So there's a little different paradigm there that creates a disconnect in how, as a council person, I think about the city budget. So,
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Although we do have the impact fee stream.
no, I understand
Which-
all that, having
which-
served,
but-
you know,
Yeah, I know.
and I understand the fees really well, and I understand why they're there, and I fully support that. But on the city side, there's a different kind of,
Well, the whole transfer tax thing is just, a shambles, so.
yeah, well, amongst other things, yeah. So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
In looking at these emergency plans, what happens if the wastewater treatment plant is inundated and completely out for a year or two? I mean, the city dies, right? If you don't have wastewater treatment,
Well, I suspect it would go on without treatments wouldn't die. I don't think everybody would leave. It's happened to other places where they took time to rebuild. Hopefully, temporary things can be brought in. There are temporary plants that you can.
not house for everyone.
I don't think the city would die, but it would be a die or
Certainly
certainly.
the treatment.
They'd have
will not
wastewater
be to
going
the
in.
level you have. now.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Well, and this is where the advantage of having a community that's not full-time, where there's a whole lot of houses that can choose not to be
Yeah.
activated at some period of time, can reduce the loaders.
And
However long.
the inundation level at the plant is 9.2.
Yeah, and that's when,
So it would only, if the wastewater treatment plant was inundated,
Mhm.
it would only be, I don't want to say the least of our problems, but the community would be really, because the inundation levels at that point would be astronomical. The amount of houses that would not be habitable. I'm not saying that, because that's all the risk factors, but
It would reduce the number of people using the system.
yes,
yes. But, okay, so maybe not inundated, but let's say power outages and road damages and whatever were such that the treatment plant couldn't be operated for, say, a few months. Are we prepared for that kind of situation? If you can't get the people to the plant, if you can't get the supplies you need to make it run.
but that's what this GHG study that we're having done addresses. Okay.
one of the pieces that we had brought up, and if you can remember, it was at the discussion back in September of 2021, and it was a mutual aid discussion with Sussex County, and the question had come up on having bi-directional flow back to the county. That is a portion of, if, you know, if you look at the option of hardening the plant, is that something that prevents your N-1? Which is, if the plant goes out, how do you're switching the situation with the county, which is where we treat X amount of flow. And we would switch and send flow back to them.
And of course, they would be perfectly able to do it all because they wouldn't be affected by any of the things.
They're at 20
Wolf Neck
is high,
is on top of a mountain.
yeah,
That's
next to Mount.
It's relative.
Yeah.
Sussex County Mountain.
Fine.
But that's the assumption. you made.
How many, sort of to what she just asked, how many days can you store? You know, if there's an event that takes down the final treatment and discharge.
Depends on what time of year it is.
Yeah, I figured that.
Yeah.
Like,
Not
well,
much.
so it's like days with peak,
Not even days.
No, your hours.
okay, and you know, sort of low usage days.
Mm,
No.
More
No.
hours.
no,
More hours. It's a few hours.
They do advanced math on
yeah, even if you're doing like partial treatment, you'd have to partial treat. Like what happened in 2019, we partial treated out of the old clarifier.
Yeah.
So
Right,
you
and
would,
that's not that most municipal plants don't have
Right.
days and days.
Right, right.
you need
Now,
to
the
look at
county does it at Wolf Neck, where they have lagoons and Long Neck, where they have lagoons. But that's part of the treatment process.
But right
So
now,
again, the
you can't pump back to them. Is that
No,
correct?
there's
So that bi-directional thing, is that committed? Is that happening? Or is that still
No,
on the wish list?
that's still gonna be discussed. That's gonna be discussed through that GHT
Yeah,
discussion.
that's gonna be part of it. But it has been.
And how much would that cost?
Yeah.
That's in the GHD study.
Yeah, but I mean, is it-
Yeah. It's gonna be the cost of upgrading your pumps and then valving to go send it back to X point. But if you're relying on sending, so if you minus the county out and depending on the season. In the off season is where they send us most of their flow. So they'd have to have, the force main would have to have enough capacity in the wet well and pumps at their lift station would have enough capacity for 600,000 gallons.
So it's 350, 400,000.
That's more than that. You're probably in the millions. I'd say between 2 and 4, depending on when it happens.
Also, if it's that destructive, the flow to the plant is decreased because the people aren't there. And of course, as I pointed out before, to press, I think I've said it here. If we got to water elevations where people were not using the wastewater treatment plant and had to leave the beach area, for instance, every toilet and every house that isn't filled up is an open hole in the ocean. And that's an awful lot of water. An awful lot of water that's just gonna continue to go to whatever pump station could take it.
Well, and just under less extreme conditions than that. What we're seeing is the INI.
Right,
Infiltration.
that's your first level and peak, and then there's the open hole.
And we, we track that on a monthly basis. Rainfall versus pump station flows. To try to figure out where that is, but we saw. With Ian, who's still here, go home.
Yeah.
A tremendous increase in
Did you?
INI because of the duration of rain and
Can you tell from which direction it's coming? Is it all Cedar Avenue area? or-
we will on the next report.
The tough part is with older infrastructure, we don't necessarily have flow meters, so you
Yeah.
gotta base it off pump run time.
Right, right.
But if I had to lay a finger on, I would say the over would be that it's more on the beach side.
All right, I don't know how to answer your questions anymore. I mean, we are, I think that what we're doing here is building for the planning for the future and how to build things going forward. So I think we are addressing that issue. Now, are you talking about where Austin's gonna be, or Rhonda's gonna be at a specific time in the emergency? I mean, how?
So I guess what I have in mind, and maybe it's all something that everybody believes will happen regardless. I no longer believe these things unless we commit to them. That we set out a statement of conditions on a schedule moving forward that will change and that will require that we change accordingly. Because it sets a schedule in motion.
Now, one of the things, the ideas that we're promulgating here. You know, one of the agenda items is when are we gonna get into the next item on the agenda. So we're gonna look at, you know, when we're gonna do that. Do we do it now? We do everything now. Do we do it when the new installation is installed? That sounds, you know, a new asset is added. We do it then. Or do we do it when it's being upgraded, an asset being upgraded? And do we have a deadline? I put on the chart. In 2030, yeah, 2030 and maybe 2035. So we have a time schedule that we're gonna recommend when to, you know, implement recommendations. Is that kind of?
That's kind of what I'm saying. You know, my sense is asset by asset. The
Yeah,
question will depend on.
we'll get into that next.
Okay.
I think we're almost there. So are we okay not doing a separate mitigation plan?
At this point, because the answer is, we're waiting for the engineering study, or we're discussing with the county. That answer might be different 6 months from now.
Okay, that's fair. But when we get closer to leading what we can do with this committee, we can reevaluate that, you know, see if there's anything that.
Is there going to be a group to actually suggest improvements to the emergency response plan, or is that kind of something that happens on a periodic basis? Or, you know, I was thinking as I was reading through it, like particularly the city part where they're talking about the assessment, post emergency assessment and stuff. And I thought, nobody's talking about if the roads are compromised, how do you get to places? But what about drones? There's nothing about drones in any of the emergency plan. Do we have drones that are owned by the city and
No, we
BPW to?
No, we
go
don't know
back?
drones.
I mean, there's a
We
lot of new stuff
we
out there.
contract with others to do any drone footage that
Okay.
is needed for the city.
The engineers have them.
Yeah.
Surveyors have them, yeah.
Okay,
So they're.
And they do tabletop exercises on a periodic basis to evaluate the emergency plan. So
okay.
it's not just written and dormant and then done and dusted. They periodically do these exercises, if you will, to say, who would you work with and how do you work with them and how do you, you know, and then at that point, I believe that's when product improvements are made to the emergency plan,
There's lessons learned that come. out of
lessons
it.
learned that come out of those
It was
things. And
spring this year?
so streets department, for example, is integral to that because of course they have the road responsibilities and all of the other players within the city are represented there, police, et cetera.
I saw a gentleman on the middle of Kings Highway yesterday was raking leaves out of a storm sewer so that the water could clear from the road. You know, and all the stuff that we've had. I mean,
Well-
perfect sense. The city was going around and making sure the water's getting off the street.
Oh, the city's supposed to. Of course, doing sweep the streets, make sure.
But we've had a lot of blowing and
And then
leaves, so it's.
BPW
Bad time of year.
catch basins. Make sure they aren't.
Yeah, I think the city did a good job. Unfortunately, Ian stayed for 5 days and, you know,
I
so
mean-
you can sweep in the beginning, but
You have to keep, it's a continuous thing, yeah. Even on my street, there have been a couple of areas, the storm drains that normally are backed up and ponding occurs and that hasn't happened, so they've been out there a lot. Not when I
well,
was
what I
watching.
noticed was like the storm drain in front of mine. It was covered in leaves, but then we had so much rain, it flushed all the leaves down into the
Oh,
drain.
well,
But, I mean, that was all a result of the storm. It was clean before.
sure, yeah.
I hadn't planned on going through these and having everybody comment on it, but have you done that?
Well, I've
It's like
got
a lot of
notes.
notes there.
Yeah, I've got notes. I'm going through 'em, things that I thought could be improved. But
Do you want to have everybody send me their notes and then I can kind of compile them for another meeting?
I hadn't asked that before. Do people want to get into these in detail and comment on?
well, I thought that's what the agenda was.
And just
Good for you.
recognize,
Give us a flavor.
well, and just recognize, you know, like the Infomart is ours.
Okay,
The city BPW one,
uh-huh,
we only have jurisdiction over the BPW portion. So any comments on the city portion should go to the city
Okay.
and not to us because we don't have control over that.
And I think they have a quarterly hazardous mitigation
Yes,
Chatham.
Chatham, yeah, it's,
Yeah.
I think the last one was.
Was it?
No, I attend that.
Yeah, I
yes.
can't remember when the last one was, because the last one, I think they did, there was a meeting they discussed with items to the suggestions for the updates of the plan.
Right, from.
They
the
met with
last
that, they met with
one,
the company that was doing it.
All right, I'd say if you have, why don't you pass them on, and if anybody else is going to go through that, we'd appreciate it, but I didn't see that was a charge of the innovation committee. All right, item 5, develop schedule for implementation of mitigation design. There's the charge of the utilities that we established. All our assets. You can go through that and decide. I went through it on my own. What I ended up realizing I was doing that anything that if going to be new installation for any of the items, I would definitely, I checked it. I didn't check it for the first two because they're probably not going to be reinstalled. They're existing to be renovated. So I checked that. And by 2032. The top part, through them, all of them, I put in installation for renovations. And then I had to decide when they were going to have to be done by a drop dead date. I just used 2030 and 2035. And 2035 is about halfway through the 2050 in our study. And I thought, by that time, if it was a linear rise in flooding, we'd be up about a foot about that time. And as compared to 2 feet in 2050. So we can go through this and just discuss which ones we feel should be addressed other than the obvious installation and renovation. And then come up with 2030, 2035. I wasn't going to list each pumping station or lift station or manhole, whatever. But is this the type of thing that you're interested in? We have to get granular evaluations of various things.
So not being an electrical engineer, not being a water engineer, I don't really know how most of these things work. I operate, I think, from a similar level as Barbara here. Just trying to imagine like the broader implications of these things. And the conversation we had a little while ago about the generators, possibly creating a little more excess capacity in each of the pump station backup generators and things like that. The idea of some sort of distributed generation as a way of providing alternative power. Those are the kinds of things I'm not sure they're in there, but I'm not sure how you evaluate them, but it seems to me each one of these things has some sort of a threshold, right? It has some, this is why I was mentioning criteria before. Each one of them has a fail threshold or a high threat threshold. Each of the individual pump stations is threatened at a certain elevation, I'm assuming,
Yeah.
based on its current construction. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's a fluid, I appreciate what you're trying to do with the 2030 and 2035, but each different pump station.
But we're also, one of the things that we'll discuss at the end, that we already have a map of our assets that we produced. We have a location addressed to that map. We have an elevation of the 2015 FEMA map for each one. So that would dictate when the renovations would be needed.
Missing from electrical utility assets are things like distributed and undergrounding.
Right.
Well, right. But we're going to go, the last one is talking about policies and programs. And it's basically identifying things that are helping to slow down climate change and sea level rise.
But those two things she mentioned have multiple ways of being applied, right? One is from a policy perspective, reducing the demand, greenhouse gases and all that kind of stuff. But then there's the real fact of the community you mentioned that the lights never went out. There's coming up with alternative ways of supplying power to parts or all of the community that don't involve the centralized grid-based approach that we've been doing things.
And, we do have a policy that says all new developments have to be underground. And that,
Other services too.
and the services, and that for you can't put in a new pole, you have to underground. So
Is that like substantial damage?
no, this is just, if someone comes in with a building permit and they are in between two poles. And they want to tie, and they can't tie in the middle of the line because of configuration. They can't put a new pole in. You have to underground the utilities. So we do have, but that's not necessarily saying that we've gone far enough, but we've moved in that direction.
But I think about, for example, Cedar. I know you've got a big project lined up at some point to do what just got completed on Powhatan, and I'm going to say thank you, and all, it's great now. Have you evaluated the possibility of undergrounding certain assets, electrical assets down there while you've got the streets open, doing the pipe work and all that?
No, we really haven't.
But it's one of the reasons, I was gonna say, it's one of the reasons why we're doing the Cedar Avenue flood mitigation study. So that we can understand that very question, right? If you're gonna go ahead and do water and sewer and you're opening it up.
Right, streets open, now's the time.
Well, and that's why, because it's this, so you get three animals. DelDOT, you got the city, which handles the above grade, and we got us that handles below grade. So there's us being, proactive and having this discussion and working jointly. And then there's the gorilla in the room, which they will need to be.
This is a study we're just applying for funding for jointly. See. BPW.
Candace, were you on the board when the discussions took place about 10, 15 years ago to underground utilities as new road work or roads were refurbished?
Part of the discussion took place then, 2011.
But, times have changed also. We have directional drilling
Right,
There's a lot
yeah,
of other
there are other things that weren't available at that time.
at that time. And there was also, in my mind, some short-sightedness on BPW's part about, stringing lines versus.
Well, and at that
underground.
point, there were fewer new developments being discussed at that point. The plethora of new developments in the surrounding areas weren't part of that conversation. It was mostly retrofitting existing city streets.
Right.
And the question of what would that take, how much would that cost benefit analysis, and then troubleshooting, maintenance, and diagnosing problems was part of the conversation as well.
Right, and that was the big part that I remember.
There's a big.
What's
So
that?
big cost and the funding piece of that, because you can go and get SRF loans for water and sewer. Well, electric's not as easy as an animal to get funding or subsidy for. I know the IRA kind of opens
Yeah,
up the
so
door to that.
there's a paragraph in the IRA that talks about proactive funding being available to mitigate post-storm recovery. How that's gonna get implemented
And
is
then
left to be seen.
the
So you
other,
would say to do prophylactic changes in the system
Yeah,
so that you don't have to replace lines after a big storm.
yeah.
but then that goes into grant writing, and if we don't, and I don't believe the city has anybody on staff that like, that's what they do, that's their bread and butter. When we were at our conference, that was, they were hiring consultants left and right, because everybody wanted free money. I mean, it's everybody, you basically, you're selling yourself to try and get that funding. So you're competing against others, and I know there are plenty of people that have gotten, I look at it from, do you get the redundancy? You can write the grant for the electric, but you can also write the grant for redundancy at pump stations. But then you go back to supply chain, because those are, you get hit by a category 4 and you got nothing for the storm surge. You can't tell me some of the underground isn't compromised and some of those transformers are, which then leads into the discussion of what are you gonna get faster, pad mount or pole mount?
Right.
And that's the other piece, because they factored in, they said, okay, you still got 500,000 people without power. If they're underground, you could probably put a lot of quicker overhead than you can underground. And the other, like right now, we did on Powelltown Road, we're putting all brand new stainless steel pole mounted transformers up. Longevity wise,
You guys just did that in front of our house the other day.
they're going all the way down, stainless steel.
So actually, this conversation about funding was the thing I thought of when I went back and looked at all the things I missed while I was gone. And you sent Sharon sent a document, a condensed, looked like a PowerPoint presentation at some conference.
It was an MPPA conference.
And the thing that struck me, I don't have a grasp of the numbers involved with the things you have to do on a daily basis. But it didn't seem like there was anywhere near enough money in those grant
not.
streams that they were talking about. When the storm comes and all the damage is done and all the other places that'll be damaged, we'll never get the money. So I'm all for that prophylactic expenditure ahead of it.
I don't know whether you noticed about that conference, we got that thing. There were, there was a discussion by the financial organization that presented it to us, but it was all about working with FEMA and HUD, those types of things. And there was a couple examples of undergrounding landed or installed previous to a storm, not response to a storm.
Right.
The one in Florida, and one in Michigan. So somebody had political pull to get that done, because everybody up and down the coast is going to want underground. That's just.
But frankly, if, I'm not saying we can figure that out, but ultimately, in the long run, that's gonna be the cheaper way to go. I mean, barring what you just said about the immediate getting everybody back up problem. I'm assuming that if we can get ahead of it and do it before the storm comes, we can.
So damn expensive, because I
Right,
mean, for this town, it'd be great aesthetically
Yeah,
as well as,
right.
but I mean, what's the ratio between the cost of aerial versus underground?
Well, I'll put it to you this way, so stainless steel transformers were about, I'm gonna say 1,500 to 2,000 a piece, the same equivalent pad mount. Given we just ordered through Southeastern was 3 to 4 times the cost.
But then the underground,
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
and then if you have compromised conduit, then if you have to bring a company in here to actually bore, then you're paying the bore cost for the pipe, because PVC pipe is through the roof. So it's pretty different. It's a lot easier to hang wire than it is to bore and pull.
Hang and rehang.
but it's
Yeah.
probably a factor of 10.
It would.
Yeah.
We
I mean,
just
look at
discussed a
Rehoboth.
factor of
It's not
10
just
when-
twice, it's like 10 times.
In 2011, it was a factor of 10 that was.
So
what
we-
stuck in my head.
except with,
Yeah.
with the IRAs talking about the fact that for areas that are having are susceptible to repeat damage, it can be more cost effective. And the other interesting thing about what's in the IRA, and once again, the actual implementation regulations have not been written, but as opposed to things like drinking water and wastewater, it's income of the community.
Yeah.
This stuff is about the government paying upfront versus paying down the line. And there doesn't seem to be a means test on the electrical side for hardening. Now, we'll see what finally comes out when the regulations get written, but we might have more of a chance of getting funding for that type in critical areas like the beach.
And we're unique to add to this, we're unique because we're a part of DMAC, which has the 8 organizations.
Right.
The interesting part is that we are, in my knowledge, if I'm missing something, we are the only utility that sits directly on the coast that it owns and operates its own electrical system.
I think.
What do you mean?
Because the other-
Statewide, nationally?
No, just looking at the state,
Okay.
in the state, to be in directly on the water.
Everything else is done Marlboro Co-op.
Well, let me just ask a question here. Does it make any sense for the city and BPW to share a grant writer person?
Well, I'm thinking of that electrical, DMAG.
I mean, I think if you hired somebody, you'd fight over him or her pretty quickly, with do this project. But it sounds like they could more than pay for themselves.
Well, I think there's been discussions about U of D. The public policy, what's the group over
I
there?
don't know. Has there been conversation about grant writing?
Yeah,
Collaboration.
through using U of D, which,
Well, I mean, somebody has to get out there.
You're probably right. I mean, on board with nonprofit and
I've heard it
we
at city
hired
council, I've heard it.
we hired a grant writer and
It's an art.
she's more than
it
capable.
is.
It is an art. People are really good at it.
Yeah.
So we said, just to follow up, we set up a meeting with University of Delaware. Because we missed the presentation they had, so we have a meeting set up between myself, Robin, and Kim. I think in 2 or 3 weeks to go over.
Well, why don't you switch the slides and hire that person?
But they would do it under contract.
They would do it under an assistance program. The problem is that you're utilizing somebody else to tell your story. Because it's an art to try, you need to set yourself apart from others.
I would think that would be a good rule for DMAC though.
Well,
All the towns.
It is, if your scope is for electric, but if you're
Yeah.
looking to write grants for hardening of pump stations and stuff like that, then you're
Well, I
kind of
think
moving away from.
That would be.
I don't think you can delegate it to somebody else. I think you have to have a lead person collecting your information and telling your story.
But then they need to be technically capable of.
And then,
doing the
I mean, different
Descriptions.
context, but
Yeah.
I applied for Department of Veteran Affairs contracts. I have a guy in Florida, he knows how to do that. I write up my story. It comes back looking organized. It comes back, in their format. The grant, people who are gonna review that grant. It sounds terribly repetitious, but, they want this section right there. They won't have to look for it.
Has the city discussed this at all? Because we've discussed. it
Hiring
several
grant
times,
writers?
Or how to get.
Not that
it.
not that I've been part of.
They mentioned,
The city
apply for
has
grants.
applied for grants on its own.
Yeah.
And I think a good number of those have been done through the financial team. But those are things that they've applied for in the past, and so they've got the formula for the grant applications, but I don't know if they've hired anyone for grants that are not kind of their bailiwick.
It sounds like something else we should probably put onto the meeting with the city.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, it would be best if we had our own, but it might be people that do it part-time. That we would have it full-time, wouldn't be as good as having our own person.
Russ,
That'd be a good way to start.
looking at this list,
Yeah.
and maybe
Go ahead.
it's embodied in the columns that you have here. You know, again, I don't have the familiarity with these items and their vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
But when you look down, which of those, given the conditions that we imagine will exist in 2030 or 2035, require a change in approach? A change in equipment versus we can keep on doing what we're doing, we might just have to get a new model.
Or raise them up. That's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah, yeah.
So, you know, well, things like manholes, that's an easy thing. I mean, when we put a new manhole in, I mean, so I'm looking at its installation now, we definitely should be designing the manhole to be very watertight, which most of them are now. But we should probably have a locking cover, very watertight. Most manhole covers, or your standard manhole covers, they used to have vents in the top, holes in the top, and they still do in some places, but they don't flood. But you can get locking manhole covers that are watertight, so it's a flooded area, nothing will go down into it. Those manholes do leak.
And only from the top?
Yeah.
Not from the
They're
side,
not,
any other joint?
they're not real, no, well, if they're built properly, they used to have to be out of brick, and the brick would.
Right.
Cement would crumble, and the bricks would break, and, you know, the water would come in, they weren't very watertight to start with. The new ones are precast. but gaskets between the sections, and, you know, very tightly built.
But
But still,
we've done a
manhole
survey
covers-
of the manholes.
But-
To know which ones we have to go back and reline.
Relining now, I think, will replace some of the manhole covers in frames, so that they're watertight systems. You know, there's a manhole there by two dips. It sits back off the road.
Yeah, in the back.
I mean,
Oh, yeah.
pond around it.
Yeah.
It's raised up, and
It's you stand on it to fit.
dollars to.
Yeah, we drove around the other day in the high water and saw that manhole surrounded by water.
I bet that's not watertight. It's
That's bringing all the gravity flow from.
Yeah.
Up that way,
yeah, but
back Alaska.
it probably doesn't have a watertight cover and frame and all that. I bet that type of thing brings in a lot of work. So, you know, that's a major, and something we could do starting now. Every manhole we build, I'm not so much worried about the manhole or the contacts with its pipe, but the frame and cover should be watertight. So that's something you can learn easy, like, and it has to do with houses, but like electric meters, we really start sticking them on fire than they are now
You got like,
in the flooding areas.
yeah, the water production wells, because you're gonna have the conversation whether you diversify. The plant, at what point do you discuss redundancy there? Water tower, that's for fire flow.
Raising pad mounted transformers, existing ones, we raise some of them, we can raise them higher now going forward. It's not gonna be pretty when in the beach area, when you have transformer up, you know, 5 feet off the ground or something.
I'm wondering,
It might stir some thoughts in people who live down there.
Well, and the
Well, one
other-
of them, why, they've already raised mine once, but it's still not high enough to meet our new criteria.
well, and from a visual aspect, the other thing to think about is that if you know, in the grand scheme of a perfect world, the entire beach side is underground for electric. There's still a need out there for the wireless antennas, so there's gonna be a pole somewhere. Doesn't matter what you do, and we know that just by example of people coming in applying. Not that it's already.
So that's happening now. There are 5G antennas coming in.
Well, we have an application.
Yeah, we
for
don't know.
the list that you have here.
Yeah.
You have a time frame that each of the items would you put under modifications to it.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, since you have the timeframes there, should the list be expanded? I mean, instead of wastewater treatment plant in either 2030 or 2035, should there be portions of it that need to be listed, you know, or should the sanitary sewer piping be broken down further into certain areas, or, I mean, do you feel that it might be necessary to expand the list of items since they're going to be applied to a date?
So you're saying like within the sanitary sewer piping thing, the lowest elevation areas that are most immediately vulnerable
Yeah.
need to be.
Right.
With
Maybe
the
break
schedule
it down to a
for-
general area of the beach area, or.
Yeah.
Is there people that are going from anything that's left in clay,
Right.
go to PVC? Is that-
Right,
is that-
and I don't know if it's necessary for this, but it comes to mind that. Some portions of the sanitary sewer piping may not need to be done in 2030, but could be done in 2035. And so why not break it down into those areas that we really want to aim at early or something?
Yeah.
And not just wastewater,
So
Other
a phased
items also.
approach.
Well, I'm trying to add on to what Mark said. I'm a little confused by the chart.
Okay.
Because it answers to some questions. You said, well, our policy for new development is this, or our policy for existing is that, or will we have to go renovate something? And then there's what about the rest of it? Other than the low line or whatever, so. Seems to me like we ought to pick a direction on many of these things. Here in the next year, 18 months. You seem to have some direction on pump stations. And what you do,
Maybe,
and so. If Boston says, okay, pump stations, we're doing this, in the normal 5-year capital budget will be done, or only have somebody relating, then you say, okay, that one's gonna be done by
we could
2030.
Well, we're gonna reduce the map to show where all the assets are as regard to FEMA 2015. And so we could say all the items in 2015-7 should be done by 2030, or the year we decide, and all in 8, maybe another date, as the water levels rising, making sure we anticipate that and install them according to their elevation.
Right, you're basically, this is what I just wrote down, is you're basically doing a 3-dimensional analysis that says, what's gonna be vulnerable at water level A, which happens in year X. And, what further assets will be vulnerable at water level B, and so on and so on.
Yeah,
That
but
schedules, that sort of starts to set you up. I mean, I'm assuming, just based on what I know about, like the list that Austin gave earlier of the most vulnerable areas from a flooding perspective, you're looking at the beach, you're looking at the areas between Cedar and the canal, you're looking at maybe Alaska Avenue, you're looking at the area down there by Missouri, California. On Cedar, you're looking at, I don't know what an issue it is at the back end, the inside of Cary Creek, it's the back end of Donovan's Road and the developments down there. I don't know what the neighborhoods are called, off of Sussex. Or Savannah's Place and all that, right? Some of those places that are back there, a couple properties on Sussex Drive, I don't know what it looks like. But as I've said a number of times.
Those are all on septic too.
Yeah. I drove around the other day and noticed the mounds in some yards, but the mounds not in the other yards. So so I'm intrigued by what you made earlier, Mark, about every valve, every fixture that might be flooded at some point down the way. It seems to me it'd be nice to have some way of putting those into the mix, whether it's a policy that says.
The important part about that is that all of that is on private property. It's
Yeah.
not owned, so it's a tough nut to crack.
Yeah, that's why I said policy.
Yeah.
is something that says, we all have a role here.
Aren't we going, like that, then get us into building codes? Some of the leak would control the height of the toilet.
The existing ones, I mean, there are devices you can put in. You can put a float valve on a sanitary sewer lateral, so that if the outside water comes up, the float closes the sanitary sewer, so nothing inside the building can get into the sewer.
How do
You could put a battery powered valve there.
And then when somebody flushes their toilet.
It's easy to say when it's a.
If that's in a sanitary sewer lateral, as you know, it doesn't flow very fast or very heavy, and have it float in the pipe.
Well, it wouldn't be in the
something-
pipe. It would, it's a valve on an arm that closes, slide into the pipe. Oh, I mean, it's.
But there has to be some intrusion into the pipe to
There-
measure it.
Well, it's
To
it's
put
like
the
a
valve
gate
there.
valve.
Yeah.
A
But
gate
it'd be an
valve
open,
with a
Oh,
level.
it would be an open.
It's an external valve. It's just measuring water level
The
around. the pipes.
operator of it is external.
Yeah.
And so it may take a little vault for each one of the bloody things, and. There are
But that-
ways, whether
But you'd
it's,
You'd
But
have to
that
have
would be
something.
only in the floodplain.
Yeah.
So
that-
then you would have to have code that says if you are in the floodplain, this is what you need to do.
well, or it's at the property line and it's yours, not theirs. That's, there's a fun idea.
I look- Saturday night. Have a nice day. Saturday night.
That was-
phone
that
with
was,
my brother at 1 o'clock in the
Robert's
morning
last suggestion.
Because he wanted to come to school.
When he left.
Yeah, really. To prevent backflow into his house in St. Petersburg. And talking him down from that. And so I finally got him to go to the plumbing supply and get hydro seals and put it in the low-lying toilets
Yeah,
and the shower drain,
right,
which are the low points.
right.
Then he was worried about the bathroom sink. It's like, Mike, the water gets up to the sink.
There's some.
Don't worry.
You should have been from there.
So, I mean, there
That's just-
are short-term mitigation measures that that you can do.
Well, I do think, I make light of it, but I do believe that the lateral openings are a big problem. That they are going to really super impact if the flood gets as high as a commode. And, and there are ways to address it. And of course, maybe the grant writer can help us with how to get the money to do that. But,
That would be homeowners issue, wouldn't it?
well, if it's in the homeowner's property, yes.
So that would be.
Or
That
do
would
you
be-
take it, does BPW take it upon themselves?
Well, there's a lot of
That's a
homeowners
big
who would
question.
do it. I mean, if you said. You need to do this, or this will protect your home, and it costs you X thousands, there's a lot of them who will sign up.
So maybe the thing to do is, rather than trying to get into any type of enforcement or anything else like it, is an information package that gave options for low-lying areas, like an external valve or, my 2 o'clock in the morning,
Right,
hydro seals, but if you had them in. I have to have hydro seals in the house, by the way, if anyone needs them, so.
I have a house on the beach, I'd put one,
the thing is that it's not so much a problem for the homeowner. The homeowner is already SOL, they're flooded. But it's a problem for the sewage treatment.
Yes, it is.
Well, on that
Pump
side,
stations.
it is a problem for the homeowners because it's now raw sewage coming back into their
If
house.
it travels in
Rather
that
than-
direction, it may not
Right.
travel in that direction. It may be pumped,
Right.
especially if we do all of these hardenings of the pump stations. That water can be removed, but it's gonna just be continuous. If the floods there.
Maybe
So,
you just answered the question I had, which was, is there an incentive to build on what you guys are talking about with policies and the recommendations? That says, in those homes that are lowest lying, it's in your best interest to do this.
Yeah,
One, because it helps BPW manage its waste, but also it prevents, I don't know if it's the same device, it prevents things from backing up in your house. Are there building code requirements that take care of them now, or is this in addition to what's?
It would have to be probably in addition to, I don't think there's anything in there to call that.
and the next item. Program.
I mean, the city went
I
for
just put down, the
for sprinklers.
had provide guidance to homeowners.
Say
flooding.
So where's it?
Add that.
So I apologize, I don't have a solution or a recommendation. But I understand why you chose 2035, the halfway is linear. But I'm not smart enough to know if the risk is linear.
I just threw that in there as a little.
Yeah.
We could discuss that and determine that, but
Yeah,
there
because I mean,
should be some dates, I think.
because I mean, if the risk actually increases parabolic or as exponential, that date may be different. Because I don't know if the barrier beaches, the barrier dunes become more susceptible, and I don't know the answer.
I mean, we could go back to Benrex curves like we did for the 2050 and see where 2030 would be. Use that because it's probably not linear. I threw that in there as a.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good starting point, right?
Right, and those curves, those different colored curves are built to accommodate that risk question. Right, you pick a different color curve if you've got lower
We're gonna
risk.
use a higher.
Well, we're using the
Worst
hard
case,
Right.
anyway.
Right.
So we could pick out 2035 and see what it looks like and adjust it one way or the other. Or even 2030. I just threw that in there.
Yeah.
Some type of.
No, I think the approach is good.
But does, if we identify all the assets on a map and identify their elevation by FEMA 2015, would that address most of the concerns about the implementation? And, assign 2030 to one that's a little bit higher, and 2035, I think the lower, 2035 to, it's in a higher risk.
So FEMA 2015 is basically 9.
I'm sorry.
Didn't we talk about 11 before? I'm not sure what you mean by FEMA 2015.
That's what the Denrex plan references, 2015, that those curves are for 2015 and sea level rise.
But to your point, I think that's the FEMA floodplain map. What we added on to it was the sea level rise at the maximum plus 3 foot of seaboard, which brought us to 11.
1164.
That's not 11, but yeah.
So, yes,
Yeah, when you said FEMA, I'm thinking the FEMA floodplain, which is what the city uses as its standard for most decisions.
and that's the
And that's a
base.
lower elevation than what you just talked about.
Well, but
and
that's the
understood.
base that we're building on. We're
That's
taking that,
Start with
we're
that.
adding 1.6,
Okay.
whatever, and then we're adding 3 feet on top.
Right, as
Do we-
long as
do
we're
we-
working, as long as the,
Do we have that slide from the GHD that I sent out earlier for this committee, where it showed how they arrived at that, their figure? It shows it starting with 2015 map, and then what was added to it.
yeah, I was away when you talked about that, and I distinctly remember that they itemized subsidence as one of the items.
Yes,
And most of the sea level rise numbers, like the Delaware numbers, incorporate subsidence into that
Yeah, and
process.
so we agreed to, since we were arriving at basically the same figure in different approach, that we would use their approach, so we were
Right.
consistent with them.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I put in the minutes so far. So that was that
There's a
little,
there's a little graph with it.
yep, and I read.
See, this was for that treatment plan, it was on FEMA was it AR7?
So this was the GHD formula.
Yes, and this is what we agreed to accept, since it basically was the same as ours, just to be consistent with what they had used. And we were gonna use the 3 feet
Mhm.
for everything.
Yes. So that's how you get to that 11.64
Yeah,
that
well,
Bob was just talking about?
yeah,
Okay,
right.
okay.
Okay.
Right, so if you take those numbers and you track them down to 2035, seems to me you start being able to make a list of assets that need
When they need.
attention, right?
Attention.
I'm assuming
Yeah.
that for all the items that were on those maps that were here a couple of meetings ago, you have elevations. There's a wrong assumption.
I think.
Well, no, what we were using was
Elevations up there.
the maps, which dictate the flood elevations.
He meant the.
Sorry, so for every
Yes.
point, I'm a GIS guy.
Yeah.
For every point that's on that map, you know, that depicts pump station. You know, is there an elevation that matters
I think.
that either does or doesn't play with the flood levels that are in that thing that we just had up?
Even if we didn't have it, we can get it, and we have the Trimble unit, and we have the small unit, we have the staff unit, which will give us that.
It seems to me that where you have vulnerabilities, you know, where process wise you have vulnerabilities when water gets in, you want to have all those elevations, you know, for the pump stations or whatever they might be, the various pieces of the plumbing. That helps to prioritize a schedule, you know, set up a schedule of operations, right?
Yeah.
We have to have these done by this time. Now, again, this whole flooding thing is, you know, through time, it's in addition to there being some key level that matters, there's the fact that there's going to be an increased frequency of lower level events, right? I mean, maybe it's built in here. I can never have pump station get wet. I can never have this joint in the pump station get wet. Or I can tolerate it being wet 3 times out of the year. I don't know about those statements, but there are ways that we can rake open that flood curve and probably start to say, and I think I've shared with you, Austin, the predictions that NASA and NOAA put together to sort of say, you know, in 2030, you know, you're likely to see floods above this level X number of times per year when it only happens once a year now. You know, those kinds of things will help to refine how this list works out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we can do it. I think we'd probably draw our line at pump stations, manholes. I don't know about what else you think, Robin. Control
I think
panels.
it's control panels, yeah. That's the biggest thing, probably. I mean, you're pretty much sure your manhole is gonna be
Yeah, it's elevated
ground
to the
level,
road,
yeah,
unless it's out, like the one that's out elevated.
yeah.
Just
Right.
a question about the pad mounted transformers. You know, you just talked about stainless steel transformers up on poles. We think of pad mounted transformers as being things that are mounted on a concrete pad. But is there conceivably a time when we would have something between the pad mounted transformer and an existing pole mounted transformer that still interacts with an undergrounded conduit system? You know, it may be uncomfortable to have the transformer that you have in your front yard. But what's if we have them elevated at, you know, something of the height of these 5G towers, these 5G boxes, where, you know, all the wires are underground, but they're coming up and doing their magic with a transformer at a suitable elevation. It may not be very pretty, but would it be functional?
That's getting close to a power man, to a hold down transfer.
It may
Because we're
be,
using fiberglass pads for all of our
I mean,
transformers,
yeah,
sectional.
there are ways of setting up transformers off the ground. And then there's also different, all the connections and everything are inside are supposed to be watertight. Okay, because I mean, otherwise,
Can you put a transformer on pontoons?
you just need that long extension cord.
coil of wire.
It's-
Although actually, if you went out to.
I'm sorry, I'm asking goofy
They
questions.
were at the very.
But you get where I'm coming
from. Highlight.
If the major vulnerability in the system is the transformer.
That's why you go back and forth on whether or not, like at the end of Preston Street, if you're at 4 feet, do you put a pad mount transformer or do you put a pole mount? Stainless steel, for example.
But I guess where I was going with my
Is there
long-winded
no-
thing, and I'm sorry, I'm so long-winded. That's one question. The other question is what you do with all the wires that connect to it, right? Are they all aerialized or are they underground?
For the transformer itself,
The wires that connect to the transformer, that come off of the transformer, that distribute power to the houses.
all underground. If it's coming from a pad mount, it's coming, they're
Oh,
serving.
but all
underground.
connections are,
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
all-
everything in
all
the transformer itself.
yeah. We're getting, I'd like to keep this to 2 hours and we're basically 2 hours now. Do you think by next meeting, I'll be looking at the staff bill. We get that map updated and the chart of the locations and what flood zone they're in. You added the addresses to them. So then we could tie that into what time frame it needs to be 2030 or 2035.
All you're gonna need is elevations.
But that
To
thing is
expand.
going out to shooting all the elevations. So,
Maybe Josh and Mike.
yeah,
We're not doing manholes or anything else, just the main pump stations and, you know.
What about the meters? What kind of an issue is that?
Which one?
Electric meters?
Electric meters aren't nearly as a problem as what water meters are, because water meters are in pits and they're underground.
And they need to be watertight if they're flooded?
Your problem, your 9 times out of 10, if you're talking about water getting into the pits, it's coming from the bottom, not from the top.
Right, which is gonna be my question all along the way is, are we accounting for groundwater seeping in all around?
On those pits, we run into, and as technology's gotten better, we've had instances where people said, if you got 5 feet, the earths will read up to 5 feet underwater.
Okay.
When you're in coastal towns, but you're battling it no matter what you do, because you have to have your connection coming in that pit, and that's an area that you can get it from the top and the side.
But from a risk perspective, I mean, the Earth's not reading. It's a billing
It's an
issue,
inconvenience.
but there's still water to the house.
Yeah.
But the electric meters attached to the house, electric meters, at some point, we're saying they should be up. And that's not a big thing, anything new, we could do it fairly soon, I would think.
Right, my worry is all the existing infrastructure, existing houses are out there, particularly the older ones, like the house I used to live in down by the beach, I think all the utilities come into the original part of the house, which is, comes into a garage and the elevation is 4.6 feet. There's all sorts of potential there. I'm assuming there's lots of houses down there that are like that.
mhm.
Is there a spec now on the minimum height of meters?
Electric meters,
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I can't remember
Brett
reading.
shot me something, and there's something that talks about that, but it's gotta be serviceable. That's the whole big issue,
Yeah,
is if you put it 12 foot in the air, someone's gotta build a service that. And I think the electrical code talks about that.
if our elevation is 11. Grade is like my house, 4, that's 7 feet, it's not too bad. Maybe like you do internally, we have a platform that's required, to lift it up. To read it.
Yeah, it's again, it
You
goes
don't
back
have
to
to
all that.
really read them anymore.
No,
I mean,
you don't have
because
to read
all of
them.
our stuff is remote reading.
Yeah.
So,
But it's removing, you have to remove them, put them back.
Solar meters.
Yeah,
Let,
so
let us.
there is something in there that talks about that, the electrical code talks about it's gonna be serviceable. Without, you don't want your guys up there on a ladder mess with a meter and down it comes.
Sharon, can you scroll down?
Sure.
Yeah, I have a question about stormwater utility assets.
Yeah,
I
that's-
I don't know if this is possible, given the groundwater elevation, but I've been reading about cities putting in stormwater storage basins below ground. And I don't know if that's something that we should or could be considering, as well as the kind of green solutions to stormwater management. Does that fall under the city or under the BPW if you're talking stormwater management?
That's a really good
You know,
question.
creating more marshland, that kind of stuff.
That sounds like a city.
Well, it depends on, like, if
If
you're
I'm,
putting,
well,
Go ahead.
but if I'm not mistaken, at the library, when we constructed the new library, there is a stormwater catch area underground, but you cannot drive on that area.
Mhm.
It's a green area that's bounded by shrubbery and it's contained. And there was at one point, the Parks and Rec were saying, oh, that's a great location. Let's plant some trees there. And I went, stop, I'll stop, so that particular configuration, and there may be other different ones that I'm not aware of, but that particular configuration to store the stormwater does have challenges associated with it, because you can't do other things on
But the-
top, and we don't have a lot of
space.
space.
Mhm.
But there are other stormwater storage means. I'm sure you've seen going on in some developments right here. It's a great big orange, like Quonset huts. That they're layering underneath and then put the parking lots on top of them.
But on the beach side,
Yeah,
where we have.
You already have high water
Yeah,
tables, so that's not gonna be.
but I mean, even surface water you can't store out there, so.
Right.
So there are alternatives, and there's actually some developments that are being proposed, which are using those measures. But from a citywide perspective, the volume would have to be so astronomical. I don't see.
And the space question kind of comes into play, that where would you do this?
You couldn't go to the beach side. And right now, water is sitting in the grass. At the end of my cul-de-sac.
Yeah.
That's a groundwater level.
Well, and
That's
there's no
saturated
public,
ground.
That's the groundwater.
and there's no public property in the city pocketed around for those kinds of.
Right, and this is the problem, right? If you could determine what the 2030 groundwater table, what the water table is gonna be, how many
Groundwater.
more stormwater problems are we gonna have? Just on a routine storm basis at that point.
Well, maybe the study we're going to start to get into some of that. Let us work on this for the map, the charts that go with the map. Say what's going to happen when, bring it back at the next meeting. Okay,
And expand the table a little bit, like the solar under electric utility and underground.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that, we won't go into it, but I don't. We have these are things we're not talking about next, but we'll drop it to the next meeting, but we talked about things that the city should be doing, solar and so forth, and what city should be, BPW, what am I saying, city? What it should be encouraging to the public, what are the policies that should be. Well, that would be one of them.
Is this a typo? List of work to be.
I did, so it's probably.
And then we're way overdue.
No, that's when.
22 is supposed to be 23.
What sheet is that?
No, that was when it was gone.
Oh,
We completed by our last meeting, I think.
Oh,
Okay.
so it's not
Yeah, I
5
think-
and 26, it's.
These are what- These are what. Yeah, these are what we had completed, and we agreed upon, the board agreed upon by September 26th, so.
Okay.
Um. What are we missing? Um, Going forward, what issues? Haven't we addressed? I understand that if we feel that we haven't addressed. The planning as thoroughly as we should. Um, is there any other big issues? Because what I'm getting to is, we're setting these criteria for going forward, but we can't implement them ourselves. Staff and consultants are gonna have to implement them. And what else should we be passing on and we're not discussing? I haven't come up with anything. That's what I'm asking everybody here. So I want to make sure we're not.
That was question.
Yeah, right.
On the conversations that we said should be jointly constructed between BPW and the city. I jotted down 3 items, and perhaps these are topics that could be brought to the next joint BPW city meeting. Grant writing,
What's that?
flood monitoring system, equipment, and emergency plan updates. Those are the 3 that I identified as topics for putting in there.
We're getting close to that meeting. It won't be part of the next month, but I think maybe after the next month's meeting. We might be in position.
To set up a
Set-
meeting
set
for
a
that
meeting.
and then include some of these,
Yeah.
okay?
To Chris's question, and I'm sorry if you already answered this question months ago. But, we spent a lot of time talking about sea level rise, flooding related impacts of climate change in general. Did we dispose of the need to consider temperature related threats moving forward as a challenge to, I guess, the heating degree days, cooling degree days, the demand for electricity? The Delaware Climate Plan has, some numbers in there, and I may have cited them up in a meeting like this months ago. I'll go back and find them, but it basically says, whereas we have so many days today that are over 100 degrees, we can expect so many more days over 100 degrees and so many more days over 85 degrees and so on. So that to me is a loading problem. I don't know how significant that problem is.
Actually, so Florida has already in many places. I hate to keep giving Florida kudos, but anyway, has incorporated that exactly for that reason. Because it really is an impact down there from air conditioning roads.
And,
The numbers I've seen
Water
here-
good for irrigation.
Right,
That's
exactly,
another issue.
exactly.
The numbers I've seen up here for temperature don't seem to be anywhere near as alarming as what's happening down in the southwest and the southeast. However, we keep talking about sea level rise. The other aspect of climate change is precipitation change and its impact on flooding. And as we saw by Ian, they had 40 inches of rain inland in such part of Florida. And I don't know what our total is so far.
Yeah, they had it on WBSC this morning.
A little over 6 was what they reported, about 6.25, I think.
Slaughter Beach got about 10.
Yeah.
Best
So-
got 4.
These storms that are stalling now, are creating that, and that impacts flooding. Because we're not blessed with topology.
So the question that comes from that 6 inches, 4 inches. As far as I can tell, I wasn't here in May when we had that Mother's Day storm. Was there a lot of rain in that storm too?
I don't think it's as much as.
So those numbers sound like they're beyond the present stormwater design curves. But I don't really know. You know, how many storms at that volume
To
can
give
we
you an
handle
idea,
in a year before our stormwater retention basins and so on aren't gonna work as we hope they're gonna work?
the current FEMA precipitation numbers for this area is 9.2 or 9.6 is the 100-year storm.
Okay.
And what's a little bit of a fallacy there is that that's a 24-hour window. It doesn't consider the fact that these windows are burning. So, there's both the volume and the duration that's impacting. And as we saw in Florida, the worst flooding in the central part of the state was 2 or 3 days after Ian passed, as everything started to drain to the low-lying areas and Lake Okeechobee was full. So there was no outflow. And, you know, I fear that that type of scenario is the real risk for us here. And we don't have good data on it. And, you know, FEMA is saying 5 years to do anything. So, although this may accelerate that time frame.
Where would we get data? You mentioned, I guess, one or two, on the temperature related.
So I went back and looked, you know, I know that Delaware Climate Plan used some level of information. I'm happy to look into it. You mentioned Dan Leathers before. That's the first stop I would make, would be to talk to him about what. I mean, we're asking for predictions. We're asking for, you know, looking forward rather than what my sense is they do mostly, which is compile existing and historical data. I don't know how much Dr. Leathers is out in front.
It seems to me that FEMA has put out those numbers. I can't remember, I know I've read the articles on
But then if I can find it, you know, it'd be great.
it. Yeah, I'll certainly,
The next
I think, because it, with the southeast and southwest, it was both the impact on utilities and the impact on utility workers that they were concerned about, that, you know, when they had the 120, 130 degree days in the southwest, you know, you couldn't have utility workers out there working continuously and
Like fixing power lines and whatnot.
I think I asked the staff at our last board meeting about what our increased income was over the hot period, I guess August period. You didn't have that ready at that time. Have you noticed like water usage and power usage were out of range typically?
and don't give my number.
No, because even when we were doing our budgeting and Kim's on here, we've been looking at it and we budgeted an increase based off similar to like, you know, you're anticipating transfer tax going up because of build outs.
Right.
But even what we budgeted off of, and I thought we budgeted very conservatively, we're still right at the
Really?
same as what it was last year.
That's
Yeah.
surprising.
So you're saying you expected growth and it didn't come?
And
We expected increased revenue and it didn't come. I don't know if it's from growth or conservation. Meaning people are using less water, or is it, we just didn't see the growth as far as more demand coming onto the
I
system?
know there was a period when I had my irrigation running a lot more, that I added another day to it because it wasn't keeping up.
And it seemed like it was a lot hotter this summer, but my geothermal system sends me a report of how many cooling and heating hours I've used this year versus last year, and it wasn't appreciably different from last year, despite the fact that I was darn uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Well, so that speaks to the point I wanted to make, something he said earlier. We can have all the absolute measurements we want, but ultimately it comes down to how each resident feels and what they do with their thermostats that makes it different.
But the water number, going back to it, part of that we thought might have been offset by people putting in irrigation wells outside the city.
I'm not sold on that. A lot of it, like, for example, a larger demand comes from STI Farm. This is the month and the
Yeah,
previous
that's-
month, they backed off a little bit on production, so.
Yeah, we don't know what's going on with SPI Pharma. But, from a pure residential perspective, I don't know that we have a good number.
Well,
So my
so,
expectations would be is that it's up, and from a degree day perspective, from a cooling load, August was higher. I'm not talking about what we build and stuff like that, but it was.
so I'm assuming as you start changing, like you did down Pilot 10, you start putting more meters on. And I talked with several people that were wondering about irrigation meters as opposed to the regular domestic meters. You should be able, as time goes by, to be able to start analyzing changes in irrigation use.
Yeah, I mean, there's gonna come a time in the future when Robin's handling this, is that we're gonna have through the EPA that's coming down from the state, you actually have to have a cross connection control plan. So anything that's tied in that's not being used for domestic use, that's irrigation, whether it's metered or not, you have to have backflow prevention in place. And so, and that falls, as it stands right now, it falls on the property owner to have that inspected annually. The board still has to vote on that policy. It still needs to be presented to them, but it's being passed down, similar to how lead and copper is. Same thing. There's new legislation that's coming down, and it's by fall of 24, we have to be able to acknowledge what we're serving the customer and also what's on the customer side. We have to have every service inventoried by October of 24.
So this sounds a little more regulatory than some of the stuff we were talking about earlier in terms of best management practices and things to do moving forward, but it sounds like it kind of fits with.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting there.
Well, we're all gonna have a role.
Yeah, and then it's tough because, we've talked about it, and I've talked to Denrick about this, is that on the East Coast, people don't view water like they do on the West Coast. And so here, it's there, it's readily available, and there's no shortage of it, right? In the West Coast, everybody's looking at it much differently. Like, reuse is becoming more of a topic. Man, I wish we had reuse water, purple pipe in this town.
Yeah,
Because irrigation demand, that is where we see the greatest influx. Like, it is instantaneous because everybody's kicking their irrigation on at the same time.
I talked to the general manager, BPW, where we got on the board, and suggested that this was before Darren. Because that was before with Ron and Ned and all the rest of them. And I talked to Townsend, Lingo, and they were agreeable.
so this is basically sewage effluent. What is purple pipe?
Treated.
Yeah.
Treated.
Treated effluent,
Yeah, yeah.
especially with the high quality effluent you guys put,
Yeah.
that's perfect,
I know.
perfect, and all through Florida.
Oh,
Is your brother in St. Pete using purple pipe?
Oh, yeah, the whole area is,
Yeah.
but it's the same discussion of undergrounding electric utilities
Mhm.
that, and also the value of water in this area is much less than the other regions. But, the underground, laying an extra set of pipes is the same thing. It's even worse because if you're rebuilding, Washington Avenue and the other ends aren't connected, putting in purple pipe until the rest of the system is built isn't there.
I've got to cut her off.
Sure.
I just got a reminder, I have a meeting coming up, 25 minutes.
Okay.
So can we set a date for our next meeting? I'll try to do it a month from now, like the 2nd or the 9th. And if you stay on Wednesdays,
I can't make the 9th, but
2nd,
second, I could.
The second is,
it's Wednesday. Any other day, 3rd,
no, I've been mom duty.
you got mom duty.
Well, and actually, but you guys can go on that.
Well, if everybody's good for the 9th, you can do without me too. Go to the dentist.
Ninth is gonna be a short week. We're off 2 days. The offices are closed. Just throwing that out there. So it might be a little packed for us.
oh, with that election day.
That's right.
Yeah.
election day is better.
Yeah.
How about Tuesday the 1st?
I'll still be eating my candle.
Probably knows my schedule better than I do.
Can we do 10?
Okay,
On the first. Mhm.
So November first.
Right, please do so.
Could I ask just one quick question? Whose plan was this one, the hurricane?
It's,
Yeah,
I think,
for
it's for one. It's part of their,
Oh, Infomart?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Because I didn't recognize any of the names and,
Okay.
having Granger and Office Depot. And all that
There's
stuff.
always,
Aaron's on, you want to see if you have any questions?
Oh.
Hello, Aaron.
any questions?
Aaron, do you have any questions?
Hi, I don't believe so. I think I'm okay. I think the one thing is, and this is kind of going back a little bit further, and it's something that Preston had said, kind of the concern about people still being there, and it was kind of mentioned in the earlier meetings. Are we talking about the year 2050, or is this going further down the line? I'm not, I don't want to do an article on it or anything like that, but that would be the second time that it's been mentioned about people not even living, in the vulnerable areas.
I guess I misspoke, I don't know. No, there's no time frame attached to that at all. I was just saying if things continue to get worse, there could be some time in the future that, worse is that.
It's a hypothetical.
The hypothetical is just,
And has to do with, if we get hit with a storm, how things go, projections,
what he said.
but it's not. We are by no means,
No.
and
Postulating, postulating that.
As Tom said, if people are there, we're gonna serve them. And so we were just saying.
And that's what I thought. And, it is mitigation. So, I understand that it's planning for the worst case. And I guess the follow-up question I had is not necessarily a follow-up, but in the previous meetings, there had been talk, especially Austin, about, being one disaster away from there being a transformer shortage nationwide. And I think that, you guys are okay with the stockpile, I believe, from my understanding. But what has this hurricane done in terms of the transformers now? Has this really taken a hit to the transformers? Or do we not even know what this has done to the transformers?
So we put an order in I think at the end of June. We have not heard anything about that impact. I would only assume that being one of the only suppliers that are meeting lead times, that somehow, some way, whether or not somebody had an absorbent amount of stock to be able to put out there. I can't help but think there's an impact. What that impact is, I don't know if anybody knows that yet. I know that if you look up articles, so through the American Public Power Association and through articles through CNN or MSNBC, they talk about how the impact of supply chain has put a hold on how fast they can bring everybody back online. So I would only have to assume that that has some sort of implication downstream on who ordered or where they're pulling that demand stock from, or that stock demand from.
Yeah, and just to add to that, what's been going around in the transmission distribution press, industry press, is they haven't even started the inventorying of what assets need to be replaced. And so there is no forecast now. One of the mitigating things there is that the housing market is turned down slightly. So there is a little bit less pressure on it from a growth perspective. But I don't think we're going to know for another week or two how bad things are down in Florida.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Great question. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Was that it?
Oh, no, that's fine. I was done.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you. You're welcome.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? I do have one.
Aye.
That was a good meeting. Thank you.